I didn't notice the time until my cup went cold. That's how mornings start these days. Me, a half-empty coffee cup, and the low hum of the cafe air conditioner. I was flipping through a worn copy of On the Road when I saw her across the room, smiling at someone behind the counter. My mom's best friend, Mary Ann, in the flesh, like she had stepped out of some memory I wasn't supposed to remember. She looked different, softer somehow, like the years had layered something over the sharp edges I remembered. I tried not to stare. Failed. Her hand brushed against her coffee mug, and I caught myself noticing the way her fingers lingered around it, like she was holding on to more than just a cup. "You're early," she said when our eyes met, a small twitch in her smile, almost a laugh that didn't come out. "Yeah, I like it before it gets busy." My voice sounded too loud, even to me. She nodded, folding her hands around her own cup, and for a moment the world shrank to the hum of the espresso machine, the clatter of spoons, the way her eyes caught the light. We didn't sit together. I ordered my usual. She picked something fancy, and yet we kept noticing each other in little ways. Her glance over the rim of her mug, the tilt of her head when I laughed at a joke I hadn't meant to say out loud. Tiny threads pulling at the air between us. I texted her once, months ago. Never sent it. Something about a movie my mom and I had watched. Something about, remember when, and then I paused. Maybe it was too much, or maybe it was nothing at all. I folded the napkin under my cup, just a little too carefully, letting my fingers linger on the soft crease. I watched her tap her spoon against her mug, back and forth, and for a moment I wondered if she noticed me noticing. Probably not. That was fine. The thing about Mary Ann is that she carries people with her, even when she's quiet. You feel remembered, even if she's just nodding or sipping her coffee. And I, apparently, had been craving to be remembered in that small way, because I caught myself turning pages slower, looking up more often, just to see if she was watching. "You look different," I said, and immediately regretted it. She smiled, like she understood the sentence even if it sounded awkward. "I've been told that. You too, I suppose. College suits you." I shrugged, too aware of the awkward pause. "I guess." Words felt heavy, and the smell of coffee was suddenly sharper. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that makes you want to know the next thought she's holding back. "It's good to see you," she said, looking at me like she might mean it. Or maybe just polite. I couldn't tell. Didn't want to ask. The bell above the door jingled as she stood, ready to leave. I stood too, unsure if this was the moment to say something, anything. The words clung to my throat. And then she did something I didn't expect. She leaned down slightly, whispered, almost casually, "There's a gallery opening tomorrow. Thought you might like it. If you want to come." I nodded, my heart kicking against the quiet of the cafe. "Sure. I'll be there." She smiled, that half-smile again, and walked out. I didn't move until the door closed, until the sound of her heels faded, until the cafe felt empty in the way that it suddenly had before she arrived. I sat back down, fingers tracing the cold rim of my coffee cup, staring at the spot where she had been, thinking that maybe, just maybe, something had shifted, even if I wasn't entirely sure what. The gallery was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, of the shuffle of shoes against the polished floor. Mary Ann was already there when I arrived, studying a painting of muted blues and browns. "You came," she said, not surprised exactly, more like she had expected me to. Her tone carried that calm certainty she always seemed to have. "Yeah," I said, fumbling with the strap of my backpack. "Thought I'd see what all the fuss was about." We wandered the exhibit slowly. Not together, not apart, but in that strange in-between space where conversation drifts easily. She told me about the artist, something small, like a childhood memory of painting in her kitchen when her kids were little. I laughed quietly at the image of her, paint on her hands, scolding flour on the counter, and I saw her soften at the sound. "Your mom would have loved this," she said, almost in passing. And I felt the words press into me, because she shouldn't have said that. "Not now." I nodded, turning the sentence over. I didn't answer, because what could I say? My mom's best friend, divorced, carrying her own quiet regrets, and me, suddenly noticing things I shouldn't. At one point, she reached for a brochure and handed it to me. Our fingers brushed. Just for a second. The kind of touch that disappears before you can measure it, but lingers long after. My stomach turned in ways that didn't feel right, and yet it felt inevitable. I imagined what it would be like if I said more, if I reached out while she wasn't looking, if I could somehow tell her that I was aware of the gap between us, of the risk, of the quiet pull. I didn't. Instead, we settled at a small table in the corner with tea she insisted on ordering. She stirred sugar into hers slowly, and I caught the flick of her eyes toward my cup, like she was checking if I had enough, like she cared about something so ordinary it should have been meaningless. Do you ever wonder, she said softly, how different life could have been if things had lined up differently? I blinked. Sometimes, I admitted. And I meant it, though I didn't want to. It was reckless, just the tiny acknowledgement that maybe I was part of her mind the way she was part of mine. We sat in silence after that. Not uncomfortable, just dense with things unsaid. Every tick of the gallery clock seemed louder, every subtle shift of her posture meaningful. As she stood to leave, she placed her hand briefly on my shoulder. Not to guide, not to steady, just there, for a moment. Enough to make me notice the warmth of her skin, the subtle weight of her presence. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. And then she left. The gallery felt emptier than before. I traced my fingers over the spot she had touched, and I knew that this, small and silent, was more than just a gesture. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me that I didn't plan to see Marianne that evening. The laundry room was supposed to be routine, just a quiet hour to catch up on the week's chores. But there she was, crouched over a stubborn stain on someone else's shirt, her sleeves rolled up, hair tucked behind one ear. "Oh, hey," I said, suddenly aware of the space between us. Too close. Not close enough. She glanced up, a flicker of surprise. "You do laundry this late?" "Yeah," I mumbled, fumbling with a sock. "It's quieter." She nodded, pulling herself up, brushing lint from her hands. "Quiet's good." It should have been normal, mundane. And yet, it wasn't. There was a rhythm to the way we moved in the tiny room, a silent choreography. Me folding, her sorting, both aware of the shared air, the accidental touches. I wanted to lean in. I didn't. I noticed the twitch in her smile when she watched me pause mid-fold, staring at a stubborn stain. I imagined saying something, anything, that would make the space between us smaller, but the words caught in my throat. And then the interruption. "Hey, Zane, didn't know you were up this late." A neighbor called from the corridor. My name sounded strange on someone else's lips. I half-turned, the spell broken. Marianne's eyes flicked toward the door. She shifted a subtle step back, and the faint tension between us slackened, but didn't disappear. We went back to folding. Silence. The ticking of the laundry machine. My hands lingered on a shirt she had just touched, and I felt heat creep up my neck. Her eyes caught mine briefly. Just a second, but enough to hold me in place. "You're careful," she said softly, and I wondered if she meant the shirt or me. I laughed, too sharp, and it cut through the quiet. "I try." The room shrank. We both paused. She leaned slightly closer to grab the detergent, and I inhaled a faint scent. Coffee, cinnamon, maybe soap. My heartbeat thundered, and I wanted to say something foolish, reckless, true. But then the dryer buzzed. She moved first, reaching out to stop it, our hands brushing. Just a flick, and we pulled back instantly, both pretending it hadn't happened. We stood there for a moment longer, side by side, the world narrowing to the warmth of her shoulder and the faint brush of her hand against mine. I imagined leaning in, just a fraction closer, and closing the gap. I could feel her inhale, like she noticed it too. Almost. I didn't. She didn't. But the air between us was charged, suspended, like we'd both glimpsed something dangerous, something irresistible, and stepped back only because it made sense. I left the laundry room with my basket heavier than when I entered, and a weight in my chest that had nothing to do with clothes. I didn't know what she wanted, what I wanted, only that the line had almost been crossed, and that it would haunt me until next time. The park was nearly empty that evening. A few joggers passed, their breaths forming clouds in the crisp air, but mostly it was quiet. I found Marianne sitting on the bench we'd claimed the last time I came here, her coat drawn tight around her, hair loose in the wind. "You came," she said. Not a greeting exactly, more like an observation. "Yeah," I said, fumbling with the strap of my bag. "Thought I'd walk a bit." We sat side by side, the silence settling comfortably at first. I noticed the small tremor in her fingers as she tucked one strand of hair behind her ear. She looked at me, and I thought for a fraction of a second that she might say more than usual, that the wall she'd always held up was thinning. "You ever feel like you're too late for something?" she asked, staring at the path in front of us. I swallowed. My chest tightened. "Sometimes," I whispered, because I didn't know how else to answer. Her eyes flicked toward me, soft, almost searching. "I think I shouldn't feel like this. Not now. Not with you." I didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt it. The weight of her words, the tremor behind them. I wanted to reach for her hand, to steady it, to anchor myself in the small proof that we were real to each other, if only here. The air felt heavier, and I noticed my pulse in my ears. She glanced down, then back up, the kind of gaze that says she's thinking the same thing I am, but can't voice it. "Zane," she said, finally, her voice quiet enough that I had to lean slightly to hear. Do you ever wonder what it would be like if things were different? If there weren't all the complications?" Her hands tightened around her coat. I wanted to answer, but I could feel the edges of restraint slicing through my chest. "I do," I admitted, the words raw even to myself. She exhaled slowly. I could hear her trying to ground herself, trying to pretend this was just talk. But the small tremor in her shoulder betrayed her. "I shouldn't," she began, then paused, like the words might escape in a way she couldn't take back. She looked down at the bench between us, at the space we had carefully maintained for weeks. I felt the pull to close that distance. Just a little. The park's streetlight flickered, and the shadows danced across her face. I wanted to ask her something, anything, to make her say it, to let her lower the wall completely. But I didn't. Instead, I watched her, memorizing the pause in her breath, the way her eyes caught the light, the subtle tightening of her hands. And I realized that the question hanging between us, unspoken, fragile, was far more dangerous than any words I could have offered. Would she dare? She didn't reply to my texts that week. Not the short ones, not the ones where I tried to sound casual. I stared at the little bubbles in my messaging app, the blank space between her name and mine, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the quiet ache of absence. When I saw her at the cafe on Thursday, she was different, polite, distant. The easy smile we had shared before was replaced with something careful, measured. She nodded at me. Yes, but there was no spark in her eyes. I felt it immediately, that invisible line she had drawn without words. "Busy week," she said, stirring her tea slowly. "Yeah," I whispered. The words felt hollow. I wanted to ask what had changed, but I didn't. Not yet. Later, walking past the corner where we sometimes stopped to say goodbye, I caught a glimpse of her phone screen. A picture, small, fleeting, of a child, laughing. My chest tightened, a knot I hadn't expected. I'd known she had been divorced, but the sight made something real, something I hadn't named, sink into me. I imagined scenarios, each one quieter than the last. Did she pull away because of me? Because she shouldn't? Because her life already held things I couldn't touch? I tried to reason it out as I sat alone in my apartment. Unsent messages piled up. I drafted apologies, confessions, jokes I hoped would get her to glance at her phone. Deleted them. Drafted again. Deleted again. The cycle became a quiet, private torture. The day after, I went to the cafe again. Her usual seat by the window was empty. She hadn't come. The barista shrugged when I asked. eyes sympathetic but unable to help. I sat with my coffee, untouched, tracing the rim with my finger, thinking about the week, about her, about the small ways she had managed to make the ordinary feel weighted with possibility. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. I imagined her sitting across from me, leaning just slightly closer, whispering the things she didn't say. I imagined her smile, the light in her eyes, the warmth of her hand brushing against mine. And then I imagined her walking away, a soft click of heels on tile, leaving a bench that felt too big, too empty. I didn't text, didn't call, just stared at my phone, imagining the unsent words forming lines I couldn't voice. By the time I left, the cafe had emptied. Chairs upturned, half-drained cups, faint scent of coffee in the air. I lingered at the doorway, hoping, not hoping she'd come back, hoping she'd notice I'd waited. The door closed behind me. The street outside was quiet, wet from a light drizzle. The world kept moving. She didn't. I walked home slowly, trying to catalog every detail of her absence. Every gesture, every pause, every glance that had meant more than it should. And yet, nothing resolved itself. The sentence remained unfinished. I found her in the kitchen of her apartment, the lights low, the kettle whistling softly. She didn't turn when I knocked, just set the cup she was holding on the counter, fingers lingering on the rim. "Hey," I said, voice quieter than I meant. She glanced up, startled for a moment, then softened. "Hey," she replied, almost too casual. But the pause afterwards said more than words could. I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of coffee, something baked, cinnamon, maybe. I noticed the small stack of unopened mail on the counter, a tiny reflection of her life that carried weight I didn't have a right to touch. I started and stopped. Words were tricky. Too much, too little, too dangerous. She watched me, patient, still, like she could see all the things I wasn't saying. She stirred her cup, then set it down. "You don't have to," she said, almost immediately, as if she knew what I was going to say. I wanted to reach out, close the space between us, but I hesitated. Everything was fragile. The risk, the gap, the things we hadn't named. I swallowed, and finally spoke, slow. "I've been noticing. All of it. You. Me. This." She didn't flinch. Didn't say anything for a beat long enough that the silence itself became a conversation. Then she exhaled, a small sound. Almost relief, almost resignation. "I've been too," she admitted softly. Not a confession of love, not even of desire. Just acknowledgement. Enough. We stood there for a while, quiet. I noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the faint tilt of her head as she studied me. I wanted to ask more, push further, but the cost of vulnerability was too real. To risk this, to risk losing what little we had, meant being honest without expecting resolution. She moved first, brushing a stray lock of hair from my forehead, a fleeting touch that lingered only in my memory, not in her hand. I felt the shift, the permission in that small gesture, the trust, the acknowledgement that we could exist here without words. "Okay," I said finally. Just one word, but it carried everything. She nodded. Her eyes softened. "Okay. No promises. No grand declarations. Just a shared understanding. A tiny human connection that held weight precisely because it was understated. We didn't cross any lines, didn't need to. That moment, ordinary and intimate, was enough. Enough to mark a change. Enough to acknowledge the pull we'd both felt without shattering the fragile balance we'd managed to maintain. I stepped back, letting the space between us return to normal. But I knew, quietly, that nothing would ever be quite the same again. It was 8:47 a.m. when I realized I'd been watching her again, across the kitchen table, spoon idly stirring her black coffee. The steam curled lazily. The sunlight fell just so on her hair. Nothing had changed dramatically. No declarations, no sudden epiphanies. But the air between us felt settled, quiet in a way that mattered. We'd slipped into a rhythm neither of us had expected. Weekday mornings, coffee, Small talk about groceries or the weather. Evenings sometimes stretched into walks. The park bench where everything had almost happened now just a marker, a memory folded neatly into ordinary life. She smiled at something I said, small and unassuming. I noticed the line of her shoulder, the faint flick of her fingers on the cup, and it made me feel both lighter and rooted. I didn't need to say anything more. She understood. Weeks turned into months. The small tensions that had haunted us, the near misses, the pulled-away glances, softened with habit and care. I didn't need her approval or permission, and she didn't need my reassurance. We simply existed, noticing the tiny patterns of each other's lives. One rainy afternoon, she handed me my jacket without a word, just the same subtle gesture she'd used months ago. I caught the scent of her shampoo, the faint warmth of her hand. My chest lifted, and I realized this is how love could be quiet, patient, and real. The bench in the park still waited, empty most days, a silent witness. Sometimes we'd sit, neither speaking, watching life move around us. Not perfect, not cinematic, just steady, just ours. And in the smallest way, it felt like home. Like someone finally saw me, not with grand words, but with the deliberate care in the mundane. I reached across the table and touched her hand briefly. She didn't flinch. I didn't need to say anything. One glance, one shared pause, and it said more than words ever could. Later, when the coffee was cold and the sun shifted, I thought about all the almost moments. The moments paused, the gestures unsent. They were tucked into us now, quiet threads that wove a tapestry we could live in without fanfare. I smiled softly, because I knew she was thinking the same thing. And that, somehow, was enough. Did this story stay with you? What kind of quiet, real love stories do you want to hear next?